So hello everyone. I won't have anything to hand out or to look at, but to listen to. The title of this talk is Eyes Mine, the Poetry of the World. I will be speaking about Eyes Mine, and the poetry of the world will remain implicit. I'd like to thank Joel Meyer, Lanny Hammer, and James Merrill for the opportunity to say a few words today regarding Merrill's poetry, formal, efficient, and material causes, respectively. Thanks also to my fellow panelists for the fine presentations and hints they've scattered in months and years past that I have taken up along the way without yet setting them down. What fine violence went to inject its gall in the glad eye, the young Merrill wrote. Continuing some lines later, the eye attunes. What follows is a sketch of a longer, larger argument, hence the numbered paragraphs. 1. Eyes Mind. From Saint, in the Country of 1,000 Years of Peace, 1959, sharing with 3 other poems in the volume, including Mirror, a rhyme scheme so characteristic of Merrill, penultimate syllable of one line, rhyming with the final syllable of the next, an experiment in combining so-called feminine and masculine rhyming. Quote, you are afraid below your hotel window, piazza blackens and hisses, you do not go back, you hold it all in your eyes mind. I remember reading these lines for a course I taught in special collections some years ago, a topic of Merrill in the archive, and only perhaps on the 3rd try did I catch Merrill's play, his inversion, see that it was not mind's eye. Only then could I be said to have begun to hold it all in my eye's mind. Up to that point, my mind's eye and the settled habit of a phrase had gotten in the way of my actually seeing what he was writing. 2. Slowing down the process. Quote, reading as active amusement, a game demanding the highest alertness and the finest degree of sensibility, judgment ever awake and steady self-possession with enthusiasm and feeling profound or vehement, close quote. Reading, that's an interior quote, so quoting. Reading at this level, to borrow Coleridgean terms a second time, quote, brings the whole soul of man into activity, close quote, still quoting. Coleridge was speaking of the poet and the power of imagination. This might, see now me breaking in, this may well bring to mind I.A. Richards' important 1934 volume Coleridge on Imagination. The author of these lines, the author of the lines I'm quoting, having worked with Richards in England in 1931-32 and becoming his colleague at Harvard 2 decades later. Now we go back to the quote. But his, Coleridge's words, describe very well the way we read when we enter into, or rather engage in, experiences of imaginative literature. I say amusement, still quoting, not pleasure, to stress the play of mind, the play of the whole being, that reading of this sort calls for, close quote. Ben Brower, the teacher at Amherst, who affected Merrill most deeply, Lanny notes, continues, back to the quote. Active amusement is the reading habit I am concerned with here, and more especially with the role played by the teacher of literature in encouraging students to acquire it. The teacher of literature has a special interest in encouraging students to respond actively to all the uses of language, from the barely referential to the rhythmic. He is always more or less consciously urging his students to make themselves readers of imagination. How does he or she go about reaching this noble aim? I'm still quoting. By a method that might be described as slow motion, by slowing down the process of reading to observe what is happening in order to attend very closely to the words, their uses, and their meanings, close quote, by training the eye's mind. 3. An imaginary course. At the outset of the introduction to the classic 1962 volume he edited with Richard Poirier in Defensive Reading, Brower observed that, quote, the description of an imaginary course later in the text is based on courses given at Amherst College and Harvard University. The particular exercises and devices described are all drawn from these courses, but all were not used in any one course. Close quote. In spring 1944, Merrill took the Amherst version of this imaginary course. It was called Reading Poetry and Prose, which Brower had begun teaching not quite 2 years earlier. It was his first encounter with Brower, with whom he would subsequently write his senior thesis on Proust that Tammy was talking about. This course, and the better-known freshman composition sequence at Amherst, provided, quote, an immersion in the waywardness of language, close quote, Poirier would recall. Besides Poirier, other instructors who taught Hum 6 at Harvard under Brower's watchful eye and contributed essays to the Brower-Poirier compilation of, quote, experiments in slow reading included Paul Duman, Neil Hertz, Stephen Orgel, Anne Ferry, and Paul Alpers, as well as G. Armour Craig, who taught Merrill's section of the course's Amherst iteration. 3. Not exactly synesthesia. Synesthesia, spelled C-O-E-N, as in the Coen brothers, a term introduced by I.A. Richards in Principles of Literary Criticism, 1924, to refer to the whole bodily consciousness. Quote, the incoming reports of some, at least, of the extraordinarily numerous and varied effects in the body of almost all stimuli of whatever nature certainly can become conscious. A lump in the throat, a yearning of the bowels, horripilation. Does anybody know what horripilation is? Goosebumps. Yes. Breathlessness. These are their coarser and more obvious forms. Usually, they are less salient and fuse with the whole mass of internal sensations to form the synesthesia, the whole bodily consciousness, tinging it, alerting its general character in some one of perhaps 1,000 different ways. Nice touch, that. 1,000 meaning an awful lot, a good deal more than I can specify, like Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari, Sandy, our French theorists you could learn to love. Back to Richards. Quote, pleasure and emotion have, on our view, a cognitive aspect. They give us knowledge. In the case of pleasure, of how our activities are going on, successfully or otherwise. In the case of emotion, knowledge primarily of our attitudes. But, Richards continues, and this is a beautiful moment, but emotion may give us further knowledge. It is a remarkable fact, and it's obviously quoting us because of the resonances with Merrill. It is a remarkable fact that persons with exceptional color sense apparently judge most accurately whether two colors are the same, for example, not by attentive optical comparison or examination, right, the working assumption one might know of close reading, but by a general emotional or organic reaction which the colors evoke when simply glanced at. Precisely the sort of experience that Brower's slow reading is designed to get at the basis of. In other words, the synesthetic aspect of emotional experience. Such judgments, Richards continues, are not a simpler and more direct way of taking cognizance of things how one might assume intuition works, but a more indirect and more complex way. The quote-unquote intuitive person uses his synesthesia as a chemist, uses his reagents, or a physiologist, his galvanometer. As far as still Richards, as far as the sensations which the color stimuli excite can be optically discriminated, no difference is perceptible. But an actual, yet sensorially imperceptible difference becomes apparent through the difference in organic reaction. Ergo, the eye's mind in action. 4, from a conversation. Quote, I was interested in psychology, rather old-fashioned psychology, pre-behavioristic, although I did know a good deal about behaviorism and did something towards joining them up. But my psychology came out of G.F. Stout, out of the big James Ward article in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and William James's 2 volumes, The Principles of Psychology. Those were the really formative things. Those and Charles Sherrington's integrative action of the nervous system to put the physiology into it, basically updating James. I was someone really saturated in psychology and neurology, making up a book about the literary approaches. That was a bit of luck, really. 2 quite different concerns crossing at a crucial point, close quote. That's I.A. Richards talking to Ben Brower. Principles of Psychology, Principles of Literary Criticism. 5, the bodily sounding board. Quote, the bodily changes following directly the perception of an exciting fact are so indefinitely numerous and subtle that the entire organism may be called a sounding board, which every change of consciousness, however slight, may make reverberate. Our whole cubic capacity is sensibly alive, and each morsel of it contributes its pulsations of feeling, dim or sharp, pleasant, painful, or dubious. Close quote. Even in the case of moral and intellectual cognitions, ordinarily perceived as, quote, pure and undefiled, quote, the bodily sounding board is at work, far more than we usually suppose, as careful introspection of feeling of bodily changes will show, close quote. That's James, not James Merrill, but William James. 6, the sound of sense. In the eye attunes, recalling the epigraph, looking forward to the next paragraph, one can detect the stress on the sound of literature, Lenny characterized as having been particular to Amherst English, owing to the outsized presence there of Robert Frost, and by the way of Frost and others, echoes of William James. 7, foliage of vision. The title of the poem, which Tammy alluded to. Back of Merrill's poem, Saint, these lines from Foliage of Vision, from First Poems, the typescript dating March 2, 1947, hence composed after Merrill had completed his coursework at Amherst, but before he received his degree. The poem from which I have drawn my epigraph, the eye attunes. Then, some lines later, quote, triumph of vision, the act by which we see is both the landscape gardening of our dream and the roots long revel under the clipped lawn. I think of saints with hands pierced and wrenched eyes, sensational beyond the art of sense, as though whatever they saw was about to be. Of Dante's ascent in hell. Of Darwin's articulate ecstasy as he stood before a tank bank and watched the creatures of air and earth, noble among such leafage, dancing, an order rooted not only in him, but in themselves, bird, fruit, wasp, limber vein, time and disaster, and the limping blood. Close quote. The limping blood. A halting, non-regular rhythm. Quote. Wanting foreknowledge of eternity, Saint begins, speaking of Saint Sebastian. Then the poet turns to himself. Quote. Wanting endurance of that moment's music, you are afraid. Below your hotel window, the piazza blackens and hisses. You do not draw back. You hold it all in your eye's mind. The women limp toward the chapel named for him. The gums water. They mumble hocus pocus. Before the painted wood baroque Sebastian, already his left foot is missing. 9, a missing paragraph. This one I've cut. It concerned the essay on the use of metaphor in literature and science, particularly Darwin's use of metaphor, that Merrill wrote in 1945 for Theodore Baird's class on science and literature in the 19th century. It also concerns the essay that Baird published a year later in the American Scholar, entitled Darwin and the Tangled Bank, and Merrill's subsequent return in the 1988 essay on the education of the poet to Darwin's amazing, quote, blending of subject and image. That's Merrill's phrasing from the 1945 essay, beginning, this is Darwin, if we must compare the eye to an optical instrument. 10, a pleasing coincidence. Alfred North Whitehead in Science in the Modern World, 1925, 9 months before Merrill's birth, speaking of Wordsworth, quote, it would hardly be possible to express more clearly a feeling for nature as exhibiting entwined, prehensive unities, each suffused with modal presences of others, close quote. After an extensive citation from the first book of the Prelude, Whitehead continues, quote, in thus citing Wordsworth, the point which I wish to make is that we forget how strained and paradoxical is the view of nature which modern science imposes on our thoughts. Wordsworth, to the height of genius, expresses the concrete facts of our apprehension, facts which are distorted in the scientific analysis. Is it not possible, Whitehead then asks rhetorically, that the standardized concepts of science are only valid within narrow limitations, perhaps too narrow for science itself? 11, I rather goggled. This is a now quote. Julian Jaynes' book on the bicameral mind, right, the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind, came out last year. Don't ask me to paraphrase this thesis, but reading Jaynes as I was finishing Mirabelle, I rather goggled. Because the poem is set, by and large, in two adjacent rooms, a dome, red one, where we took down the messages, and a blue one, dominated by an outsized mirror, where we reflected on them, from an interview with Helen Bidler. Jaynes suggests here, or in his book, that the voices traditionally attributed to the gods, like those the inhabitants of Cahokia across the river in Illinois regularly heard some 900 years ago, were actually uttered in the right hemisphere of the brain, which tends to be responsible for synthetic experience, and heard by the left hemisphere, responsible for analytic experience. Looking over some old notes yesterday, I saw that Stephen cites these remarks in the consuming myth. 12, the withness of the body. That's a phrase of Whitehead's. Quote, you see with our mind's eye, with nothing else, cited by Alison Lurie from Changing Light. You've said as much, the speaker says, Merrill, with a reference to 0.6 earlier in Mirabelle. Quote, this is the reference. We do not, this is in caps, we do not qualify as witnesses except in your mind's eye. No punctuation of minds. Then continuing on the same page. Dear Jim, just think of letters or phone calls where the absent friend is seen, and Merrill fills in the mind's eye. And then back to book 3 of Mirabelle, again in caps. You have now begun to see that the mind's eye, mind's here, apostrophe S, outlasts the body's, making our seminar possible. Merrill's returned to Amherst in that respect. The mind's eye, yes, but also our minds, which is spelled M-I-N-D-S apostrophe, plural, I, singular. Two minds, one eye, and the eyes, mind. One could then go here, I'm not going to do it now, I'm almost done, to questions of analog digital converters and digital analog converters and analog digital analog converters, which of course is what Merrill is providing in the poetry. This last. Finally, 13, give Emerson the last word. quote. With mighty whirl, the multitudinous orb grinds the bright brook into an azure mist of elemental subtlety like light. That's one quote. Next quote. Like to a child o'erwearied with sweet toil, the spirit of the earth is laid asleep, and you can see its little lips are moving within the changing light of their own smiles, like one who talks of what he loves and dreams. Close quote. So that's Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, as cited by Emerson in 7 Types of Happiness.